Today's lecture is going to be discussing the concept of transoceanic empire building. This is a little bit of a long word for a pretty easy concept. We have already talked several chapters ago about trading post empires, and you can see sort of a map of those sorts of networks that were developed throughout the 15, 16, and 1700s, early 1700s, as European nations began seeking luxury goods and finished products from places, for example, like over here on the Swahili coast of Africa, the Dutch in Indonesia, the British, and others in South Asia or India. So we saw a lot of activity going on, and Europeans controlling really not very much in terms of land mass. Mostly they were interested in the trading or acquiring, I should say, of luxury goods that they did not have at home. And what you'll move into is a map that looks something a little bit more like this. This is a little bit confusing because it signifies major industrial nations and spheres of influence as very similar colors. However, this area here, which was the Qing dynasty, will become a sphere of influence, and we'll actually be discussing what a sphere of influence is later in the week. It just is sort of a low-grade colony, and all this stuff in orange becomes a full-fledged colony. And what that means is that the European nations that industrialized, these right here, were able to exert full political control through military means over these areas in orange, and that's really what a transoceanic empire is. It's an empire that you build over the seas rather than into contiguous land areas adjacent to your homeland. So let's talk about how this actually begins. Fossil fuels unleash, as we've already talked about, a huge amount of productive capacity, so you make goods more quickly. And this, of course, makes your military more powerful. It's not just that you have advanced weaponry, it's that the supply lines for your troops become so much more robust after industrialization. You have, for example, interchangeable parts, and you have all kinds of things created through industrial processes, from like canned food to soldiers' uniforms. And all of that helps the militaries to run more effectively, more efficiently, and for those European nations which industrialized to create a greater hegemony across the globe. Countries and empires that don't industrialize, because that process of industrialization happens fairly quickly on a sort of international relations scale of time, because it happens so quickly, the countries that don't industrialize or did not industrialize in that first or second wave sort of are shocked, and they don't adjust quickly enough to that massive shift in global power. So not only do countries which don't industrialize fail to sort of shift or change appropriately to meet these new challenges, Europe also has a number of really compelling reasons to go out and create full-fledged empires rather than just attempting to acquire luxury items through trade. So first, they needed raw materials. It wasn't so much that they wanted to purchase luxury goods from Asian areas mostly anymore. They wanted the raw material, and they could make those luxury goods themselves. So, for example, Europeans who perhaps were not super excited about wearing wool clothing next to their skin were very interested in cotton textiles always, and they used to import those from India. Once the advent of the factory, the steam engine, and the industrial system come into play, what they're really after is that raw cotton that they can take back to England to sew into or spin into material, weave into material to make their own finished product out of. And this is a huge shift. And so I'd like you to put a star beside this point. Europe begins to reverse the trend. They used to import more manufactured goods, more luxury items. Now they're going to become, of course, net exporters. And we all know that finished products are more expensive than raw materials, so this gives Europe an economic advantage as well. So, first off, it's a raw materials grab. I think that's an important point. And they're going to move from being interested in trade and having these little trading posts across coastal areas to conquering full-fledged empires. And this will involve a huge investment of resources and massive incursions into the interior of various parts of Africa and Asia, rather than simply sort of hovering along the coastlines of those areas. So I think if you look at a map of European involvement in the globe before 1750, it would be very focused on the coasts of these areas, and after 1750, you'll start to see Europeans move toward the interiors. There are a lot of different reactions to this building up of empires. Some nations begin to industrialize on their own. The United States is a great example of that. Russia, Germany, and Japan all sort of pick up the ball and industrialize in that second wave, and their governments will be hugely supportive of this effort. And this is a huge difference between industrialization in a place like England and industrialization in a place like Japan or the United States. So I'd like you to put a little llama beside this bullet point. Industrialization was sponsored by the state, and we cannot really make any, I can't say that in any stronger terms. It was state sponsored. The government of all of these areas, including the United States, were exceedingly interested in gaining the power that came from industrialization. And the governments of these areas promoted to a huge extent the industrialization of these areas. A great example in the United States is the building of our railway system. Of course, in Japan, you had the creation of these large conglomerates, which were granted monopolies by the government called zaibatsu. And so you had all these different, ways of sponsoring industrialization, but it was definitely all done by the government. Or I should not say all done, but it was definitely bolstered, sponsored, fostered by the central government. Some countries are too slow. They're going to end up getting taken over by Europe, or conversely, Russia, Japan, Germany, or the US. An example of this period of imperialism for the United States would just be that expansion of the U.S. across the West to toward the Pacific Ocean. The same goes for Russia. They expanded east, in their case, toward the Pacific Ocean. Pretty much Europe was able to, not just because of the technology, not just because of the advancement, but because of the speed with which they could create mass-produced items that would help their military. Europe's Industrial Revolution made it possible for them to take over areas that they would never have dreamed about even 50 years, let alone 100 years before. We stressed the importance of the McCartney mission of 1792 from England to China to ask for trade. And we remember, hopefully, that the Qianlong Emperor of China turned Europe down. And about 40 years later, Britain came back, fought the Opium Wars, and forced China to open various ports in the unequal Treaty of Nanjing. This is really important because areas that used to just be along the coast for trade are now going to take full political control. So a really nice example of this is the Dutch in Indonesia or the British in India. And I'd like you to put maybe a few underlines under the British in India and the Dutch in Indonesia, and perhaps star this point. That's a really critical critical examples of this process. And we haven't focused a huge amount on the Dutch in Indonesia, although of course we did talk about the importance of nutmeg and the use of really violent coercion for the Dutch to take over the Spice Islands, but they're going to actually go throughout Indonesia, that archipelago that extends down and to the east from Southeast Asia. They're going to actually take over that thing in its totality. Okay, we're going to use British imperialism in India as sort of our case study, and we're going to talk about how India moves from being merely a trading colony, or an area, really, even before it was a colony, just an area in which Britain, through the EIC, was able to trade, to full-fledged ownership. And India is eventually nicknamed the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. So we'll find out how that transition takes place. Let's talk about the Mughal Empire. If you guys will recall, in time period 4, we studied several large gunpowder empires, especially the 3 big Islamic gunpowder empires, the Safavid, the Ottoman, and the Mughal. And the Mughal were based in northern India. If you'll recall, they were Muslim rulers who exerted control over a majority Hindu population. Hopefully some of us recall that the Taj Mahal was built during this dynasty, and the Mughals had a great system. They had a really tolerant emperor in the Golden Age under Akbar, and the system worked well for a very long time. However, by the time we get to time period 5, the Mughal are on serious decline. And what has happened, as happens very often, as the central government loses power, the outlying areas' rulers begin to exert more and more personal control. So, Nawabs are the names of the rulers of these decentralized states that are coming into being during the decline of the Mughal. Technically, the rulers, the Nawabs, owe allegiance to the Mughals. However, nobody really thinks that the Mughal emperor is really running the show anymore. He is pretty much incapable of exerting real political power outside of a very close central area, and so various Nawabs in various parts of India begin to really take control for themselves. Technically, again, they owe their allegiance to the emperor of the Mughal Empire. However, they begin to do things their own way, and one of the things that they were very interested in doing is trading with the British East India Company, or the EIC. If you would, just out to the side where it says British East India Company, will you just put EIC, remind yourself? And actually, out to the side of Nawab, just put Indian ruler. I think that'll be enough of a definition for you. So out to the side of Nawab, you just want to note that that is a Indian ruler. Okay, so the EIC wants to trade with India around 1750 because it wants textiles. Now, that will quickly shift over the course of about 50 years. They're not going to want textiles anymore. They're going to want raw cotton. However, in the beginning, they will want Indian cotton textiles. Nawabs made agreements with the EIC, and in exchange for some military support, because of course the British had a lot of really great weapons. The EIC had a lot of great weapons. So in support for, or in exchange for support of their rule, Britain was able to trade. And this is interesting. They were also allowed to collect land taxes. And will you all add, please, that and collect land taxes in return? They didn't technically get those land taxes. What the British became were tax farmers. So they were allowed to collect land taxes in return. Hopefully we remember how tax farming works very briefly if you've forgotten. A ruler needs taxes collected. He perhaps does not have a good centralized bureaucracy to complete that function for him. So in the United States, for example, this is done by the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. So if a ruler doesn't have that kind of robust bureaucracy, he might contract with a tax farmer to collect his taxes for him. He will say to the tax farmer, please collect, I don't know, 20 million pieces of gold. And the tax farmer says, great, I'll actually pay you for the right to go out and collect that for you. The ruler says, that's great, thank you. So then the tax farmer goes out, and they don't just collect 20 million pieces of gold, they go out and they collect 30 million pieces of gold. And that extra 10 they're able to keep as profit for themselves. It is not a very effective system, you might imagine. It is extremely prone to corruption, and it's also extremely prone to causing the peasants to be crushed underfoot as they cannot sustain their tax payments in the face of that sort of like greedy tax farmer. So the EIC was super excited because it was actually going to get to go out and be the tax farmer for many of the Nawabs of the sort of declining Mughal state. So between about 1818 and 1857, the EIC, which of course is that joint stock company, it focuses on looking for trade, and it is very much protected by the British government. Will you underline that phrase and then add out to the side that the government gave the EIC a monopoly on trade. No one else was allowed to go and trade in India, only the EIC. So again, note out to the side where it says protected by the British government. Please note out to the side that the British government gave the EIC a monopoly. So gave the EIC a monopoly. So the EIC goes, it makes agreements with Nawabs, it collects taxes for them. It does make some reforms that are beneficial, for example, outlawing sati. Sati is a term that we talked about in like time period 2, so go ahead and circle it, maybe even time period 1. Sati is the practice in which very high caste Hindu women allow themselves to be burned on the funeral pyre of their husband. Which you can imagine is not a great experience. And that was actually outlawed by the British. So there were some benefits as the EIC started moving in. And they depend on the Nawabs for support, as the Nawabs also depend on the EIC for support. And that relationship comes to, in both cases, rely on these guys called sepoys. And a sepoy is an Indian. He can be either Hindu or Muslim, but he's recruited and he serves as a soldier for the EIC. And this is a really weird concept, okay? The EIC, remember, is a joint stock company, aka a corporation, aka privately held. It's not a government entity at all. It's a company, in the same way that Microsoft is a company or a corporation. However, Microsoft does not have its own army, the last I checked. However, the EIC did. It had sepoys, and they were sort of dressed and drilled as British troops, but in fact they were not British troops. They were just the troops, literally, of the East India Company. A really weird concept to imagine a corporation having its own personal standing army. Now, this arrangement is working fairly well. However, as Britain becomes more and more and more powerful, as they become less reliant on the Nawabs and the local Indians, there begins to be a lot of tension. And that will explode in what is called the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857. Sometimes it has several other names, but pretty much what's going to happen is those troops that fight for the EIC are going to go into open rebellion. The spark for this issue is actually beef and pork fat. So this is a little bit weird. So back in the day, before modern guns, of course, you had to take like a little bullet, and it was in a little cartridge case, and it had gunpowder in with it, and you would tear that little paper cartridge off with your teeth, and then pour it into the barrel of your gun and kind of tamp it down. Um, and that was how you loaded your rifle. Well, you want the gunpowder to stay dry, of course. So what they did was line those cartridges with, or I'm sorry, not line them with, but cover them with beef or pork fat, because that would keep out the moisture, right? Fat repels water. So, however, if you are either a Hindu or a Muslim, you know that both beef for Hindus and pork for Muslims are things that you do not want to consume. And so what ended up happening was that sort of served as the spark that causes this rebellion. Now, the real underlying issue is just racism. The British had a superiority complex. They were not respectful of Indian traditions, and the Sepoys were annoyed by this. They felt that they were being treated very badly by these British foreigners. So, the rebellion is put down very violently, and both sides of the issue actually have some really nasty stories to go with them. Hopefully, if we don't have much snow, we'll be able to watch a little video about this rebellion and some of the things that happened during it. It was pretty dramatic. The EIC really begins losing control during this period of Indian history. It begins to lose control, or it's worried that it's going to lose control of India. And in order to prevent that from happening, what the British government does is actually decide to just take over India itself. So, that results not in the EIC controlling India, but the government of Britain itself controlling India. And that is going to last for about 100 years, from 1857, the year of the Sepoy Rebellion, until 1947. Britain will actually hold India as a full-fledged colony, so it will control it politically, economically, etc. They needed to keep both cotton and their opium raw materials. They needed to keep the cotton because they needed to keep their factories running back home, and they needed the opium because, if you'll recall from the last chapter, Britain was selling opium to China in order to, in order to smuggle tea out. So they were selling opium in exchange for silver. The silver was taken back to India and then laundered back through England and then loaded onto ships and taken all the way back to China to purchase tea with. So they needed to keep those supplies in order to keep their factories running and to keep their factory workers caffeinated. Queen Victoria, who was the Queen of England at this point, becomes the Empress of India. And India becomes the main source of cotton for English textile mills, and finished goods were resold in India, a complete reversal of how it had been before, and this really destroyed local handmade industries. India, of course, from really the beginning of this course, has been the source of not just cotton, but cotton textiles, and all of a sudden, all those handloom weavers who had been employed really for millennia creating textiles for export were no longer able to keep their jobs. They just could not compete with the cheap textiles that were flooding the Indian market from Britain. So during this 100-year period, there are both good and bad aspects. So we'll talk about some good stuff first. Britain improves these things: hospitals, transportation, for example, building of railroads, communication networks are bolstered. Education is expanded to more people. Laws and safety are better, given that the central government of the Mughals had sort of collapsed and things were fairly decentralized, and women's status raises a little bit, for example, outlying Sati. But there are some really, really negative consequences that sort of make these, pros look a little bit weak. So, for example, India loses self-determination, the ability for the people of India to make their own decisions. Britain often ignores habits and customs of Indian people, and through simple racism. So not only did they view Indian culture as inferior and treat Indian people as inferior, they they also instituted things, for example, like glass ceilings. So, for example, if you were an Indian, you could be educated, but you would never really rise to be a really high level official, for example, because all of those positions would automatically be held by the British person, just not through personal ability, but just through the idea that an Indian person shouldn't be allowed to hold that position through simple racism. Of course, economically, India was exploited for a full 100 years. Britain actively suppressed the industrialization of India in all but the most basic areas in order to keep their own monopoly on those manufactured goods. So there are some really, really huge negative consequences. And as a result, especially of that racism and that feeling of British superiority and Indian inferiority, Indians begin to experience a sense of rising nationalism. We will talk about nationalism next week, but I'll just reiterate that it's that feeling of being in common with one group of people. You have that identity. It's bound up often with language and culture and a set of common borders. The British use a method called indirect rule rather than direct rule, which we will see in later chapters is going to often be used by the French during their imperialistic endeavors. So because of that indirect rule in which there is that sort of upper crust of British bureaucrats, but for the most part, the people running India at the sort of mid and low level bureaucracy level were actually Indians themselves. And because of that, there's this middle class of Indian officials that begin to rise, and they are definitely educated, and they are definitely literate, and they are definitely very well versed in the ideas and values of the Enlightenment, liberty, equality, justice, etc., that we have already talked about. It's very difficult to have an education and not begin to and read some of the books that these Indian bureaucrats were reading and educated Indian people were reading, and not sort of look at your own situation as a colony being exploited by the mother nation, and sort of realize that there's something that's definitely discordant about those two things. You can't really hold them mentally in your mind at the same time. You can't have a colony and at the same time believe in liberty, equality, and justice. So Indians recognized the sort of I don't know, the incorrectness of that position, and they were really able to move toward increased nationalism because of it. Roy is one of the most important Indian nationalists. He actually founds the Indian National Congress, and Rammohun Roy actually from the 1880s on is going to be working with the Indian National Congress to not only advocate for unity for Indians, but just to increase their participation in the upper levels of the bureaucracy. They really wanted to have an India that functioned well for Indian people themselves. And this will eventually move into, the Indian National Congress will eventually move into full-fledged, not just trying to get more Indian involvement in the government, but they'll actually ask for full-fledged independence later on. However, it does tend to be an upper-class movement, and it lacked the support of sort of average uneducated Indians. And everybody, I'm sure, has heard of Gandhi. And one of the extremely important things that Gandhi is famous for is actually creating a broad sense of unity and desire for freedom among all Indian people, not just that upper class that was educated and sort of could see the irony of Britain, which espoused, liberty, equality, and justice, but yet held colonies. So Gandhi is really famous for being able to sort of take that message to the masses of the Indian population and create that kind of groundswell of support, which will eventually, in the post-World War II period, lead India toward independence. So that is actually the first Indian National Congress right there. All right, so that's sort of your introduction to the Trans-Oceanic Empires. Britain is probably the most famous of all Trans-Oceanic empires. I'm sure that you've heard, because you read it in your summer reading, the phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire." And we'll spend a few of the next few days just sort of hanging out with England and Britain and their empire, and just sort of seeing how those things actually developed. So a couple of things that I want you to remember are direct and indirect rule. And I want you to remember that phrase, Trans-Oceanic Empire, and Nawab and Sepoy. So those are all really important vocabulary words. And I know we kind of moved through this quickly, so don't let those escape your memory. Make a note card if you must.